Okay, we are just about ready. First and foremost, thank you everyone for taking time out of your day to join us, and we do hope you find this webinar insightful. Just a couple of notes before we get started. I would like to mention that all attendees are on mute, but should you have any questions throughout the presentation, you can submit it in your control panel under the questions field, and only the speakers will be able to see your questions. In addition, for those who require CE credits, it's important to be logged on for the duration of the webinar in order to obtain the credit. And you will receive a follow-up email from Plan Pilots with the certificates and details in about a week and a half. So let's get started here. Our key presenter today is Eric Magyar. He is the Retirement Director with Janus Henderson Investors, and he will be leading this educational webinar. But first, I'd like to introduce Bill Karsten, a Senior Consultant here at Plan Pilots, and he will share a few observations.
Good morning. We're excited today to be partnered with Eric Magyar at Janus Henderson, and first I want to apologize. I'm fighting a little bit of a cold, but the good news is that Eric is going to be doing the majority of the presenting today, and then I'll put in a few comments here and there. But just to provide you a brief overview, Eric will talk about recent class action lawsuits and, more importantly, what we can learn from them, and some thoughts for action plans for plan sponsors. And it'll come as no surprise for those of you who've heard me speak before. I mean, really will come down to ERISA attorneys' favorite words, which are process and documentation is really what we'll come across today, continues to be the key to providing that best protection for you from a fiduciary standpoint. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Eric. Again, thank you, Eric, for leading this presentation, and we'll let you take it away.
Thank you very much, Bill. And you're exactly right. This is a scary topic. You look at the title, Recent Case Studies of Fiduciary Failures, Why Plan Sponsors Are Being Sued, and the Importance of Process. But you take a look at the last words that you mentioned, and that's the process, just like you said. And it always reminds me of a story when the first time I played Monopoly with my wife, actually. So I picked up the community chess card, I put the money in the middle, and she's like, "What are you doing?" I'm like, "Well, you put the money in the middle, you land on free parking, and then whoever lands there collects the money." She's like, "That's not how you play." I'm like, "That's how my family's always played." She's like, "That's not anywhere in the rules." I'm like, "Wow, I'm sure it's in there somewhere." She's like, "Show me." So I pulled out all 7.5 pages of the rule book, and she's right, as always, it's not in there. So my point of that story and why it reminds me of this presentation, we don't think there's malicious intent behind these wrongdoings in these cases, but basically just lack of knowing the rules and not partnering with a qualified plan advisor and really understanding those rules of the investment policy statement or your own investment committee and ERISA. So with that, can everybody see the slides moving now? We should be on slide 2. Bill, do you see that?
Eric, we're having a little difficulty turning that over to you. So if you could just read off the pages, we'll make sure we keep it moving along.
Okay, sounds good. And I'll look for that prompt. So we're on slide 2, and here's the agenda for today. Overview of recent class action lawsuits, what we've learned from those lawsuits, and as Bill said, an action plan for all of you. So we'll spend some time more on the solutions that you could take away and possibly implement in your own plan so you're not in the headlines. So an overview of these recent class action lawsuits. Here you might be familiar with a couple of these companies, International Paper, Boeing, Lockheed Martin. ABB was really the one that kicked it off from the law firm in St. Louis, and they finally settled, and then Anthem. So big, high-profile cases, billion-dollar plans, and a lot of money changing hands. And you might think, well, I'm safe, I'm not that big of a plan. However, the attorneys are finding money in these cases, and other firms outside of the big one in St. Louis have been basically taking what they've done and copying it and moving downstream. And just so you know, too, an attorney just can't sue your plan. They do need employee or former employee to bring suit to you. So, you know, if you have happy clients, that's one way to safeguard it. And so keep that in mind. You know, with that, we'll take a look at the next slide. All right, so I have control now. Decisions and dismissals. Edison and Chevron, you take a look at $18 million was awarded to Chevron to meet an ongoing duty to monitor the investments. Now, this originally was only for $370,000. I know that that's not a small amount, but relatively, this is very important because the Edison case went all the way up to the highest court in the land. It went up to the Supreme Court, and they ruled that Edison and all plans, for that matter, have a ongoing duty to monitor the investments. And so there's no statute of limitations on the monitoring. So all the work that you do at your plan committee meetings are very important. And it's crucial that you do take notes on those committee meetings, or if you get audited, there's really no proof to show the auditor that those meetings happened. Chevron case was dismissed. The U.S. Supreme Court rejected the original case to use a money market rather than stable value. And that's good to know. You can use as a plan provider either a money market or stable value fund. There's nothing wrong with either. However, in a lot of these cases, they didn't have a reason, why they chose one over the other. And there's been some recent changes. In 2008, you may recall, maybe you had some unhappy participants. They couldn't get out of their stable value fund, even though they're yielding what we would consider today to be high yields, maybe 3-4% back in 2008, maybe more. But stable value funds are not always 100% liquid. You're giving up some of that liquidity to transfer out of a stable value fund in exchange for a higher yield. Fast forward to today, where a money market fund isn't paying out really any interest. So there's concerns and lawsuits that are complaints being filed. Oh, we have a money market, they're not yielding anything. And it could have been the same person complaining back in 2008 versus today. And it's important that your plan participants know that there's a give and take. So whether you have a money market or you choose a money market as part of your plan, it's 100% liquid, or versus you choose a stable value fund, it might have a higher yield, but there could be some what they call gates, or at certain stress points like another 2008, where your money may be locked into that option for longer than they would like. So be aware of that. The Chevron case is important because you can choose either one. There's nothing wrong with either. Just make an informed decision on why you chose the one that you did. So these cases have spread out to higher education, and you take a look at 20 universities have been sued for the following reasons: excessive investment fees, excessive record keeping administrative fees, imprudent investments. And these are the same breaches that were in the 401k or defined benefit world that are subject to ERISA law and have moved over to the 403b space. So it's spreading. It's moving to other areas. And you take a look at Brown University right here in Illinois, the University of Chicago, Duke University, and Vanderbilt have all settled in these cases. And I know Bill had some nice color to add around higher education and the 403b market.
Yes, thank you, Eric. And sorry, we didn't mean to throw you that curveball early on with the technical difficulties. Glad we got that sorted. This is something we talk with clients about a lot. Thankfully to date, we haven't seen anything come out in these lawsuits that takes us in a different direction in terms of the oversight of plans, but certainly there's some additional considerations, and we always want to make sure we learn from those, and we're dotting all I's and crossing T's. But it really comes down to having prudent decision processes in place. And earlier I mentioned process and documentation. I should call that positive process and documentation, because unfortunately recently we learned a very large higher ed lawsuit is moving forward, and a lot of what drove that decision by the courts to move that forward was actually the documentation of emails that actually showed there weren't necessarily fiduciary processes being followed relative to decisions about the record keeper and the review of fees and so forth. But pretty consistently, we're seeing that the lawsuits really are centered more around fees not being properly reviewed and negotiated. Some other categories are improper use of plan credits, which we'll talk a little bit more about. And then something else we've seen pop up, which isn't a ruling by the courts, but is something that was part of a recent settlement agreement in that Vanderbilt University case, is the use of participant data, and that's something that Vanderbilt had an agreement in terms of limiting the use of that participant data. So that's something you'll want to focus on as well.
Great. Thanks for that great addition. Now, there's some other ones here as well. New York University, Northwestern University right here, and Georgetown. And I've delivered this presentation all across the Midwest, and oftentimes I'll get a question by an HR professional or someone that's sitting on the investment committee, and has the lawsuit ever pierced through the corporate veil? Has anybody gotten sued personally because of these lawsuits? And generically the answer is no, because the individuals who sit on the board, for the most part, except maybe the CEO, they don't have millions to spend as a settlement. But New York University was the first one that I've read, and there may be a few others, but this is the first one that the individuals on the committee were actually named and ordered to be removed by the judge because they didn't have sufficient understanding of their responsibilities as a fiduciary who sits on that committee. So be forewarned, anybody who does sit on the investment committee, you need to understand as well your fiduciary responsibilities to do what's in the best interest of the plan participants. And that also goes to the fact of taking notes. And as Bill said, implementing the processes, the good processes that you have in place. And just remember, I'll say this a couple of times too, because I've run into a lot of people that they may have committee meetings, but they don't take notes. There was actually one boss that an HR representative raised their hands, like, we have quarterly committee meetings, but the boss doesn't want the notes being taken because he doesn't want any secrets to be shared. So just be forewarned, if you do get audited, which there's a higher likelihood of an audit than a lawsuit, that you need to show proof of process, proof that you actually met. And we'll go into a little bit more on investment policy statements later, but I think that's a great example of that. I alluded to it earlier, cases moving downstream, and here's some examples going down to below 10 million, collision repair space. And this is not the big law firm out in St. Louis. These are, you want to call them copycat kind of law firms going after these plans. And there's not all negativity. I don't want, if there's any attorneys on the phone, the bright side is that these lawsuits have shown light on our retirement system, and a lot has changed. A lot of money has come into these retirement plans since the 70s, where they were all startup plans, where the investments actually, there was money embedded in the investments to help pay for the record keeping fees. So this industry has been slow to move. These lawsuits have actually reduced fees, increased in plan design. So I don't want to see that it's all bad. There has been some good changes implemented, but with that, the plan committees need to be more astute and recognize their responsibilities and implement them. So with that, what we've learned from these lawsuits: excessive record keeping fees. And before we talk about what's an excessive fee, you really need to understand, how can plans be paid? And there's really three ways that I see a record keeper services that can be paid. Directly by the plan owner themselves. They can cut a check, pay for the administrative fees, and that's satisfied. The other would be by revenue sharing. So revenue sharing, when all the plans were startup plans, there was no money. It's a voluntary program that companies can allow their employees to save for their own retirement, they didn't want the burden of heavy costs to be on the owner for this voluntary plan, so they spread it across all the investments in the plan menu. With that, there are more fees embedded that are needed to run the money, to manage the portfolios, and that extra money, the revenue sharing, is a fee-for-service arrangement. And the fee paid by Janus Henderson, for example, to the record keeper, whoever that may be, those services are basically ones that the asset manager, Janus Henderson, or whoever it is, doesn't need to do, whether it's having a call center for the employees, whether it's creating statements. Having a call center, statements, and reporting, that's all done by the record keeper. So that's what revenue sharing is. And I think it's important to know what it is. It's not a pay-to-play scheme, as you may read in some of these articles. It is a legitimate fee-for-service arrangement that is defended in the court. So we'll talk about that in a second. But the third way to pay for a plan, and we're starting to see more and more of this, is to get rid of that revenue sharing. If a business owner doesn't want to pay for record keeper, the only other way to pay for a plan is directly by the plan participants themselves. And unfortunately, this revenue sharing has basically created an assumption that retirement plans are free because no one ever got a bill. None of the employees got a bill anyway. But if you take away revenue sharing and the business owner doesn't want to pay record keeping, then the only person that's left to pay record keeping costs are the participant to see it clearly on their statement as a line item. So if you do decide to get rid of revenue sharing and have the participants pay, a best practice is to have some education ahead of that decision, because there will be some sticker shock by the employees thinking that their plan was free all these years, and now they're seeing a bill at the end. So be forewarned on that. In the ABB case and Edison cases, the court held decision that the revenue sharing model did not breach the fiduciary duty. So maybe you could breathe a little easy. If you have revenue sharing, it has been upheld in the courts. However, ABB acknowledged that as what I just said, is that there's a legitimate fee-for-service arrangement that's done as well. So while revenue sharing is a legitimate practice, the missteps ABB did have, they didn't understand the amounts of revenue share being paid. They didn't understand what fee was being paid for what services, and they didn't know what they should be paying relative to other similar sized plans in their industry. And that's an issue. So that's where benchmarking can come to help with how much you should be paying in your plan. And as I said earlier, because of these lawsuits, these have been coming down over the past several years. And if you haven't benchmarked your plan in 3 to 5 years, you might be surprised how much less you can pay, and the different services that are involved with client education, auto features, auto increases to help retirement readiness, financial wellness programs, and so on. And so the problem was ABB didn't even know. They were paying whatever the bill was without any due diligence. And then you take a look at International Paper. During the lawsuit, they negotiated a lower fee, basically half. So they were formerly paying $112 per participant fee, and because of the lawsuit, it went down to $52. The problem with that is it's great, half off, right? It sounds wonderful on the surface, but is it that what they should be paying relative to other billion-dollar plans, $5+ billion plans? Maybe it's $12 per participant. Maybe it's 10. I don't know. The problem is International Paper didn't know either, and the only way they would be able to know is with a proper benchmark. And then Lockheed Martin, they had put their plan out to bid of other similar sized plans. Boeing, they obtained competitive bids because of these lawsuits. And since these lawsuits have taken place, as I said, there is some nice cost savings for all of you on this call to be had. Using retail or expensive share classes, that's an allegation you'll see on a lot of these plans. And I want to spend a little bit of time here because this is confusing and maybe a new concept to a lot of people on the call. And really the 401k industry, the retirement plan industry, 403bs, all defined benefit plans, really created the mutual fund industry and grew it to what it is today. And there are different share classes. One example is I'll use R6 through R share class. And so an R share is the most expensive share class, a retirement share class created for a startup plan. So all the revenue could come out of the investments. Think back when all plans in the 70s and 80s when they were new. And then it gradually goes down from there, R1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, R6, all of the fees are taken out. And there's different amounts to pay for different fees and services from the record keeper. So when you started your plan, you'd want to choose a revenue sharing arrangement that matched the cost. So it was spread across all the participants. So that facilitates the revenue sharing arrangement. So too little revenue sharing needs to be made up by the employer or employees. Too much can be paid for consultant fees, employee education, and so on. So that's what the fee is. Fast forward to today, there's no requirement that you actually need to use the lowest cost share class. That might surprise some of you that have read a lot of these lawsuits because they should have used a cheaper share class. That there's nothing written in ERISA that you need to choose the least expensive share class. However, the trend is moving that way. The lowest cost of participation, I've heard some auditors ask, are using the lowest cost of participation basically after all the revenue sharing is paid back to the plan. Is that the lowest cost option? But it is not in ERISA. Now, ABB, in their investment policy statement, now this is a rule that they wrote. It's not in ERISA law, but ABB wrote, when a selected mutual fund offers a choice of share class, ABB will select that share class that provides plan participants with lowest cost of participation. They wrote that, not ERISA, but that because of this such a high profile case, that thought process has been floated around and it's starting to be more asked about for audits and may become an industry standard going forward. So if revenue sharing does eventually go away, you'll have a decision to make on how the plan is to be paid for, and if the employees pay for it, a lot of education prior to that, so you don't get any complaints. So everybody really understands that it is a service that the record keeper provides to record keep the plan, and there is work involved. So care must be taken now that you're not overpaying because just the plan goes up in value. Since 2008, we've seen tremendous growth in the equity markets. And if you're using revenue sharing, you're basically paying a percentage fee on the size of the plan. Now, does the record keeper do any more work if you had the same amount of participants? And some would argue, no, it's basically a per participant fee by the amount of work that the participants do. So you should be careful on revenue sharing arrangements and make sure you're not paying more just because the plan size goes up because of great performance. I know, Bill, you had some other color to add around this as well?
I do. I'm going to represent ERISA counsel here. Eric shared some thoughts and ideas in terms of how to minimize that risk of a lawsuit based on the planned fees that are paid. There is one strategy to basically bulletproof yourself from this risk and take it off the table, recognizing there's a 6-year statute of limitations or 6-year look-back period. But if you were starting your plan from scratch, which obviously you're not in position to do that today, but we would recommend figure out the entire budget for your company or institution and have a portion of that be that you'll just pay the fees rather than pass those along to the participants, because you can't sue for fees that aren't paid. They can't sue the institution or the company for paying too much out of their own pocket for the fees. Now, for those of you who are saying, well, obviously we can't just immediately switch to that. What I would say is an interesting point in time where you could give that consideration is if there's a future date where you're looking at a change to your plan design. And that's where we would say, throw that on the table. If you're looking to change your contribution formula, whether it's due to budget cuts or it's hopefully the other direction where you're looking to increase what you can give to participants, that could be an opportunity to build in and say, part of what we're going to do here is just have the company or the institution pay those plan fees going forward. And now, in essence, now we've bulletproofed ourselves from any lawsuit based on fees.
That's a great points, Bill. And you save yourself some headaches as well as having the plan participants pay for it. And you take a look at these cases here, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, they all moved to basically the lowest share class, whether it's a zero revenue share or a separate account, which is basically a combination of stocks and bonds that they own. So that's some great best practices. Failure to follow the investment policy statement. So in the ABB case, they had a 5-year performance review, putting the fund on watch lists, removing them within 6 months. However, when they actually implemented that investment policy statement, they removed the Vanguard Wellington Fund, about $250 million, what they called deteriorating performance, and they did not even take into account the 5-year performance or put it on watch, and they moved it into, basically in this case, it was the record keeper's target date for no other reason than that the courts could find other than a cost reduction that to the plan record keeping fees. So by moving it over into whatever the target dates were, regardless of their performance, they just got caught. So there's nothing I want to advocate. There's nothing wrong with using the record keeper's proprietary managed target date. However, it cannot be the only reason that you move over to them. And they only looked at 3 funds. They looked at Vanguard Wellington, the target date, and one other. So the courts ruled, if you take a look at the last bullet point here, their research was scant or minimal because they only looked at a couple funds. They didn't put it on watch, and they basically moved it over. So they had a very strict investment policy statement, and they didn't follow it. And after the switch was made, Vanguard Wellington actually outperformed what they moved into. So just be wary of that. There's a lot of great record keepers out there with great target date funds. Do your research and run it through your process on the target date selection. If you take a look at flows and where the money's going in retirement plans, over 90% are going into the target date fund, where you might work with your consultant on the plan menu quite a bit. The target date selection is crucial, and it's deceivingly complicated. They're not as simple as you might think. So you definitely need to work with a qualified plan advisor to really make sense of that target date where most of the money is going these days. But in this case, that was one of the negatives that they didn't do. They didn't follow their investment policy statement, where Bill said earlier, having a good process and then actually following it. So their actions did not match the investment policy statement in this case. Alleged improper investments. So there's no guidelines, only debate versus active versus passive. According to allegations in 2002, International Paper replaced their passive option with a higher fee active option that in the end underperformed. So because of the settlement, they agreed to put the passive option back in. And that's a trend we're seeing a lot in plans today. We're seeing both active and passive. So a passive index where it makes sense, maybe large growth like an S&P, and then maybe choosing an active manager in areas where they can add value by actively managing that selection of security, whether it's bonds or stocks. So maybe a small cap or fixed income might need some active management there. So we're seeing both today in plan design. Improper investments. So Lockheed Martin had a stable value fund, and there's nothing wrong actually having the stable value fund wasn't improper. The stable value fund, what it was invested in. So the stable value fund typically has higher yielding securities that some are a general account of an insurance company where they'll buy securities where they yield, say, 2% and maybe pay out 1%. So they make the difference, what's called spread. They make it from what they earn, what they pay out. In this case, this Lockheed Martin Stable Value Fund was invested in money market type instruments yielding 0.01%. So 1 basis point, hardly anything. And as I said earlier, the reason you'd want a stable value fund is to earn more than the money market, because you're giving up liquidity in a stable value fund. So they agreed to have report on what that stable value fund is invested in and be very transparent about that as part of the settlement. Now, that's the most conservative money market stable value fund. On the other side of the risk spectrum, you take a look at Boeing. Boeing, a science technology firm in the 90s, this is going back into the 90s, where if you remember, the Munder Net Fund, maybe 100% return and double-digit returns in that sector in science technology for years. About 3 years, double-digit returns, and then after 2000, there were double-digit losses for 3 years. And if you think about it, a smaller segment of the market, whatever it may be, in this case, science technology, has higher highs than the broad market and lower lows. And typically, it'll revert to the mean. So it'll spread out on the average. So what goes up must come down. And the average investor may rate their investment selections based on last year's performance or the last 3 years' performance, which could be a mistake, because when the market corrects or there's a downturn, they're going to buy it at the exactly wrong time. A lot of people sold out of the market in 2008, locking in those losses. Unfortunately, a lot of people haven't gotten back into the market 10 years, 11 years later. So the lesson here is basically have more diversified portfolios that mitigate the downside risk. Some active managers can help with the downside protection, but as an asset class, a sector, a lot of plans avoid having specific sectors like a gold fund, for instance, science technology in this case. So be aware of that. I would review your plan, take a look at your investment options, and see if you have any small sectors of the market invested in there. They didn't rule against it. They hired a consultant to see if it was prudent to keep that or not. Using plan assets to benefit the company, that might be a simple rule to think that people could abide by. And under ERISA law, it states that plan assets must be used for the exclusive and sole purpose to benefit the plan participants or their beneficiaries. And in this case, ABB ignored a report by Mercer saying that they were actually paying too much on the record-keeping fees and not enough on their health and welfare services. And in this case, it was the same provider, and they were funneling profits from one to the other to help offset healthcare costs, which and hence profiting from the plan. International Paper, they engaged in a securities lending program. And so that securities lending program basically is you own securities, you own the stock, Apple, Google, Amazon, whatever it may be. And since you own the security, you could actually loan it out to investors. And, whenever you loan something out, you get interest. So they took that interest. There's nothing wrong with that. They took that interest and they put it into the pension plan to help offset pension liabilities, corporate pension. So that's where they faulted there. And Bill, I'm going to hand it to you to add some color on some other examples as well.
Well, yes, and you mentioned earlier, Eric, the Duke University case. One of the allegations there was that the plan credits were being used, that was generated from revenue sharing, was being used to pay administrator salaries. And that's a gray area. Technically, I think you could pass the test if you were able to say, okay, Joe spends 10% of his time on the plan. It was properly documented, and so 10% of his salary was paid out of the plan. I would say don't go there, but that would at least potentially be defensible. This was a settlement, so it wasn't a court ruling. Certainly, Duke alleged there was no wrongdoing, but at the same time, they agreed to settle in this case, and that was one of the claims against them. Eric, just before I pass it back to you, I just want to remind everybody there is an opportunity to ask questions online. So if you do have questions, please submit those, and we'll continue to keep an eye on that.
Great. Thanks, Bill. Prohibiting transfers out of company stock. There's no prohibition of offering company stock, but there have been a lot of stock drop cases out there. And if you think about a sector fund having higher highs and lower lows, an individual company stock that has a lot more movement than the broad diversified market. And in this case, International Paper did not allow diversification until age 50 and then only 20% per year. Because of the lawsuit, they allow for immediate diversification. Participant salary deferrals. So the actual rule, if you're in HR, you're probably more than familiar with this, but they must be deposited into the retirement trust as soon as administratively feasible, but no later than the 15th of the following month withheld. And as you know, the companies set their own precedent. If they are administratively feasible to invest those proceeds within a day, then that's it. That's as soon as administratively feasible. And there was a story from an auditor that I heard back in Indianapolis talking about there was an auditor that came to a small plan. The woman made the deposits religiously for 40 years. And she didn't want to burden anyone. She finally is going on a family cruise on vacation, and wanted to get the deposits done one day early on that one payroll. Went on vacation, had a great time, came back, they got audited. And the auditing was fine until they looked at this one payroll section. It's like, for the past 40 years, you've got those deposits in 4 days. In this case, it was 3. Why couldn't you do it for the past 40 years in 3 days? So just be aware of that. You set your own precedent in setting that. So the final section, before we finish up here, I think the most important one as well is an action plan for all of you on the phone for plan sponsors. And we talked a lot about fees. And the law states that you're not required to pay the lowest fee, but pay reasonable fees. So you might be thinking, well, what's reasonable? And that is a moving target that changes year over year. And because of a lot of these lawsuits, that number has gone down quite substantially, even over the past 3 to 5 years. So plan sponsors need to understand and document how much is being paid, who's getting paid, and the services being provided. And International Paper, ABB, that's where they fell short. They didn't know what they're paying or how much they should be paying. And you assume these billion-dollar plans have their hand on the wheel and know everything that's going on. But just like you, the retirement plan might be the 11th thing to do on your top 10, and you just never get to it. You just push it off. You have your business to run. So it doesn't get paid the attention that it requires. But that's really the key. And revenue share classes, the revenue sharing should be evaluated at least annually. Benchmarking, the industry recommends that you benchmark your plan. We talked a lot about that, looking at your fees and services relative to other companies of similar size, plan size, same industry, every 3 to 5 years. So because of these lawsuits, as I said, odds are if you haven't benchmarked your plan in 3 years, you're probably paying too much. And I talk to other people that sit on investment committees. I ask them this question, and some are embarrassed. They're like, we've never benchmarked our plan. I'm like, well, how long have you had it? And they're like, 20 years, 30 years. So if you get audited, you should have a benchmark. Of course, if you ever gotten sued, you should have a fiduciary file where you keep a benchmark in there and on the fees and services that you pay and know what they are. And then if you determine the plan fees are relatively high, you don't need to change your record keeper. I know change scares a lot of plan sponsors, and participants don't like to see a lot of change in their retirement plan. You don't necessarily need to change your provider, but you can negotiate a better fee or maybe even more services. Think of your cable provider. when was the last time they called you and said, hey, you know what? We have this promotional offer for new clients. You've been a loyal client for 20 years. We're going to cut you the same deal. Never, right? It just doesn't happen. So you need a competent negotiator on your side, someone who is in the space, who specializes in 401k plans or 403bs, that's in the industry, to actually negotiate that. Because if you call on your own, they may cut 1.01% off, or a couple basis points, but you don't know if that's the appropriate amount without the benchmark and a knowledgeable person in your corner. Revenue sharing. So we talked a lot about revenue sharing. It's a common and acceptable, it's a legal practice. However, you need to rationalize your approach. And as I've said, is the record keeper doing any more work because the plan size doubled over the past 10 years with the same amount of employees? They do work on a per participant, per employee basis. So the other thing too, is it fair for some participants to pay revenue sharing in an actively managed fund and others that are in passive not to? Is that fair? So some record keepers realize this. They actually pay back that revenue sharing to the employees that paid it. You could also strip out and take away all revenue sharing. But then, as Bill said, you need to make a decision on how the plan is being paid. And I agree with him. I think the company owner, they're in their best interest to pay it themselves. You can't be sued for high fees that the employees and participants aren't paying. It makes a lot of sense to me. So the other thing, the overhaul plan, you just need to keep a handle on it. If you do have revenue sharing, you have to know what it is and what fees, what services that is paying for. Investment policy statements. You might be surprised to learn that you are not legally required to have an investment policy statement. But if anybody on this call was ever audited, one of the first things that they'll ask is for your investment policy statement. And throughout this whole presentation, we've talked about process. How can you prove you have a process if you don't have anything written down to follow? So it is a best practice to have an investment policy statement and follow that investment policy statement. If it says you meet quarterly, you should meet quarterly and take notes each and every quarter. The requirement is you should meet at least annually. So if you maybe skip a quarter here or there, at least you write in your investment policy statement to be a little more broad that you meet annually. If you want to meet every quarter, great. You're not going to get in trouble for meeting more often than the investment policy statement says. Company stock. Pension Protection Act 2006 requires immediate diversification rights for employees, contributions upon completion of 3 years. So, there's been a lot of stock drop cases since 2008, where in the financial industry and other industries where there's drastic downturn in the stock market, you need to be aware and allow the employees to diversify. They work for the company. If they have too much stock in the company, that's a lot of their wealth for retirement tied up on the fate of one company. So they're allowed for diversifying. Target dates. So you take a look at 2018 Plan Sponsor Survey. We partnered up with them, approximately 4,000 plan sponsors, and over 63% responded, agreed that the best qualified default investment alternative is a target date. As a part of the tips for plan fiduciaries, they recommend monitoring the investments and maybe suggest a multi-manager or custom type target date. And as I said earlier, there's about 90% of the flows going into these target dates. And if you have the ability to maybe remove a single manager to comply with your investment policy statement, the custom allows for that flexibility to do so. And I know that Bill's got some great talking points here as well, so I'll hand it over to Bill to add to this.
Yes, and just along the lines of the ERISA guidance, actually plan sponsors are encouraged to consider, and consider is the key word here, but to consider custom target date or life cycle solutions to identify whether it may be appropriate for their plans. And certainly there's some pros and cons to weigh here, and just to to give you an idea how a custom solution may work, many record-keeping providers are fully prepared to support all of the record-keeping that goes with that, performance, support the glide path that would be selected. And for those who are in an off-the-shelf product, there's often that opportunity to replicate what you already have. But really the pros are, you now have a vehicle where if something goes wrong, you can diagnose the problem and fix the part or replace the part. So if it's an international fund that's not performing, you're not forced with that decision of, can we live with what this is doing to the overall target date fund solution, because it's an all or nothing decision. If you're under a custom solution, you can actually just replace that fund, or we'll call it a sub fund that's part of the target date strategy. And you can also incorporate a combination of passive and active strategies, which there's really not many off-the-shelf products that offer that combination. And even if they do, you're living with their determination of where there should be passive versus active management. So, said another way, you could incorporate, your best of class Janus Henderson funds in the lineup, while also incorporating Vanguard funds for certain categories where you would see that as appropriate. The biggest con is there is additional fiduciary responsibility that goes with that, certainly. And so, we would encourage anybody that wants to go that route, that's where we definitely think it's appropriate to have an advisor involved who can share that fiduciary responsibility with you to ensure that there's that ongoing monitoring. And Eric, I wanted to lob you a question, because nobody's asked this yet, but I know it's on people's minds because I've heard it a ton. We've talked so much about fees. So this is the question I've got that I think is intriguing is, if one plan sponsor is giving all of their employees 10% per year, but they're charging 0.2 when it could be determined that 0.1 should be the right amount of fees, are they at more risk relative to another plan sponsor who gives their employee no contribution but pays all the plan fees?
It really falls down to the fee question. Yeah, I mean, from these lawsuits, none of them really mention or highlight the contribution amount that I
right, which is crazy. There's no benefit given to that.
Right. Yeah, and the letter of the law. Yeah, are the employees better off for the person that gives them 10? Of course they are. But they're laser focused on that 2% number in a vacuum. And that's a great point, Bill, that, no matter how good or benevolent the employer might be, giving 10% away to each employee, the lawsuits focus on the 2% versus the 1%. And that, we don't see that taken into consideration. And for these target dates, we will start to see some lawsuits because we haven't seen them yet because the market's been doing very well. A single manager target date is pretty much lower in cost. And there wasn't really a need on a performance basis to remove a single manager. But since there's money there, the attorneys follow the money. Once you start seeing lawsuits, you'll see that, and I'm sure they'll bring it up. If you own a single manager target date and they'll ask, would you create an investment lineup with all the same manager, all Janus Henderson? And that happened in the 90s. I worked for Kemper funds. We'll use them as an example because they're not around anymore. But Kemper had their own record keeper, and they offered all Kemper funds, and they'd cut you a deal for using Kemper funds. And no one would do that today in a plan menu, hardly ever. And that's the same thing with a single manager target date. So I think you'll start to see that more and more as well. And as Bill stated, there is more cost, there is more fiduciary liability, but that's the responsibility of a fiduciary to do what's in the best interest of the plan participants. And as removing underperforming managers from an investment that 90% of the population is in, that seems prudent to me. So any other questions, Bill? Because we're almost at the end here.
I don't have any other questions that we've got at this point.
All right, so we're wrapping up here. And so plan advisors, this presentation really talks to the point of working with a qualified plan advisor. And through the evolution of retirement plans, at the beginning, everybody had a retirement plan in its infancy. And As you've seen, because of these lawsuits, there's more specialized consultants that focus on the retirement plan space, or the 403B space, that knows the industry inside and out. In the ABB case, they turned a blind eye to their consultant, basically told them that they were subsidizing plan fees to put in corporate benefits. And in the Edison case, the court ruled that fiduciary should make an honest, objective effort to understand the advice given. So it's not enough to get great advice and hire a fiduciary that sits on your side of the table, but really understand the advice that you're being given. And as I said, look for advisors today who specialize in retirement plans as a fiduciary, a 321 who gives you recommendations, but you actually implement the changes, or a 338 advisor who can implement the investment changes for you. And there's different cost structures regarding those as well. And then, Bill, did you have anything to add here, or should we move on? Because we're about to close things out here.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of 320, I was going to say, just in terms of 321 and 338, right, that certainly comes down to sponsor preference. Know that from our standpoint, we support clients in both capacities, and it really just comes down to their preference.
Right. I know there's a lot of numbers and lingo. I hate to just throw lingo around. So if you have any questions on that, Bill's happy to ask those off the presentation. And then fiduciary training, there's no training requirement as of right now. However, this is a great presentation if you are HCI or SHRM designation as an HR professional, or if there's any CPAs on the call. This presentation qualifies for CPE credit. We also have our top VC trends and developments piece that comes out every quarter on regulatory updates, best practices, and plan design. And Bill and Plan Pilot will be happy to share that information with you if that's something that you'd like to see in the future. Here's important disclosure. In a regulatory environment, we have to show the disclosure for this presentation. And then I'll hand it back to Bill to share a little bit about the expertise that Plan Pilot can provide.
Oh, yes, Eric, thank you. Many of the people on the call, our clients, are very familiar with us. Just wanted to give a few bullet points for those of us out there who may want to learn a little bit more about us. Certainly feel free to reach out to us. If I'm not mistaken, Eric, I think the next slide has your contact information as well as mine on there. For anybody who wants to reach out afterward with questions, please feel free to do so. And just want to take this time on behalf of Plan Pilot as well as our clients to thank Eric and Janus Henderson for leading this presentation. Hopefully everybody that participated found it to be very helpful.
Thank you, Bill. Yes, please reach out to Bill or I with any detailed questions as well. We do have these slides available. If this is something you wanted to see, please let us know. We can make that available as well as a white paper that condenses a lot of this data if you want to keep it in your fiduciary file. But thank you, Bill, for having us. We appreciate the partnership and able to educate your clients and prospects today. Thank you for the opportunity.
Well, likewise, thank you. And one last bit of housekeeping. Blasilda just reminded me to let everybody know that we at Plan Pilot will be making sure that we get certificates out to everybody so that they get their CPE credits for this. It'll be about a week and a half.
About a week and a half. Make sure if you do need CE, make sure you've registered with your name and email so we can get that out to you.
I think that closes everything up. So thank you, everybody, for participating. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day and have a great Thanksgiving holiday.
Happy Thanksgiving, everyone. Thanks, Bill. Have a great one, everybody.